And I'll open it up to our committee members. If you have guests here you want to introduce, we'll take time to do that now. You have a, yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I am privileged to have as my guest today the Associate Dean for Facilities at the UK College of Ag, who I also happen to call Dad. Dad, raise your hand. So I hope the committee will make him feel welcome today.
Welcome, Dad.
Point out he's my constituent.
Awesome. All kinds of connections. I want to introduce a college intern, a graduate fellow that'll be with us for the next year, if I understand. Emily Wiley, if you will stand and be recognized. Everyone may not can see you. There she is. Welcome, Emily. So we're missing our co-chair, Senator Howe. He's scheduled vacation. We have to have a discussion about how you schedule vacations in the future. But I'm sure, yeah, it was before the calendar come out. So he's new. We'll cut him some slack. So yes, there.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's come to my attention that because of her late arrival into the Senate, a lot of House members may not know our newest member. So I know she just introduced her dad, but I think she should also, if it's okay with you, Mr. Chairman, be given the opportunity to introduce herself so everyone on the committee knows her.
Yes, please do. Thank you for pointing that out.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I am Cassie Chambers Armstrong. I am the senator for the 19th Senate District. I like to call myself the new Morgan McGarvey. The old Morgan McGarvey is still alive and well. Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate you bringing it to my attention.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Anything else before we move into our business? We're going to flip the order, and number one will be 2, and number 2 will be 1. So we'll bring up. We were about to bypass Susan here. I was so anxious to get into the business. So let's pause for roll call.
Senator Chambers Armstrong.
Here.
Senator Boswell. Senator Carpenter. Senator Deneen. Senator Givens. Senator Thayer.
Here.
Senator Webb. Senator West. Senator Westerfield. Senator Wilson. Representative All.
Here.
Representative Kleins.
Here.
Representative Dixon. Representative Pfister.
Here.
Representative Graham. Representative Hale.
Here.
Representative King.
Present.
Representative Cook. Representative McPherson.
Here.
Representative Neighbors.
Here.
Representative Pollock.
Here.
Representative Pratt.
Here.
Representative Reed.
Here.
Representative Stalker.
Present.
Representative Stevens. Representative Tate. Representative Thomas.
Present.
Representative Tipton. Senator Howe. And Chairman Heath.
Here.
We have a quorum.
We have a quorum, and now we can get started with our business. So we'll bring up Gordon Sloan and his group, Kentucky Department for Natural Resources. And I'll ask you guys, once you get seated there, push the button on your mic. The green light should stay on. And then if you will, introduce yourself for the record.
Good morning, Chairman Heath, members of the committee. I'm Gordon Sloan. I'm the Commissioner for the Department for Natural Resources within the Energy and Environment Cabinet.
Okay, and you may need to pull your mic up a little closer, but you're fine. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm Gordon Sloan, Commissioner for the Department for Natural Resources.
Thank you.
I'm Scott Schneider. I'm the State Conservation Engineer for the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service in Kentucky.
Thank you.
Corey Troutman, Division Director for Financial Management with Energy and Environment Cabinet.
Welcome. We appreciate you guys coming out today and look forward to what you've got for us. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Chairman. We may have rescheduled things a little bit for you. I'm going to go first. I don't have a lot. I'm going to talk about watershed conservancy districts and watershed dams. Scott here from the Natural Resources Conservation Service is going to have a more robust presentation, so I'm going to have him go second, if that's okay with you.
Yes, that's fine.
Thank you. So we're going to talk about watershed conservancy districts and watershed dams. Most of these watershed dams were built in the 1960s and 70s. Kentucky has 200 of those dams. They were mostly constructed to have a lifespan of either 50 or perhaps in a few cases up to 100 years. So if you start doing the math, they were built in 60s and 70s, 50-year lifespan. Most of them have reached the limit of their design. So what do we do next? One of the important pieces is the local sponsors, and that's where I'm going to talk about watershed conservancy districts. Most of these watershed dams in Kentucky are owned and maintained by watershed conservancy districts. Some are owned by city governments or county governments, but the bulk is by the conservancy district. They are a creation of statute. They are a sub-district of Soil and Water Conservation District in the county. It gets a little more complicated, but I'm not going to get into the weeds too much. Let's just say within each county there is a Soil and Water Conservation District, and if there is a Soil and Water Conservancy District, it reports back up the chain to the Conservation District. And these watershed conservancy districts are responsible primarily for flood control within that watershed, erosion control, and the dams, water usage, flood prevention, things like that. This goes over those a little bit more. One of the things that the conservancy districts have is they can levy a tax within the district to assist in the cost to carry out responsibilities and to fund projects. However, those assessments are typically very low. Many of them haven't been changed since they were first instituted. They're assessed based on the land value or acreage. And I like this slide because it really brings home that these levies that the conservancy districts are able to levy are monetarily insignificant to fund a dam rehabilitation project or to repay a bond or to cover the cost of rehabilitation projects. So Corey is going to cover the cost here. Let me mention one more thing. So Scott from the NRCS is going to talk about paying for the dams a little bit when they need a rehabilitation project. But the cost for a rehabilitation project can be many millions of dollars. We're going to talk about a few of them. Scott has some more examples. So this levy that the watershed conservancy districts have is pretty minute. It's certainly not enough to cover their local cost share. The NRCS can cover 65% of a dam rehabilitation project, but the local sponsors got to come up with 35% of that, however many millions of dollars. And as I said, they really don't have that kind of cash. So Corey's going to talk about where they can get the cash from.
Yes, so in this current fiscal year, the budget bill allocated $5 million for this purpose for rehabilitation for the non-compliant and the high-hazard watershed dams. So that money can be used as grants for the dam rehabilitation, and the districts can apply for this through the Soil and Water Conservation Commission. And as I mentioned, they're just used for grants to these local sponsors to help aid in that percentage for what they need to do the rehabilitation.
So that 35% is going to be pretty steep. Let's talk about some of the priorities that the NRCS, the Natural Resources Conservation Service, has come up with. So they've identified 3 of these dams in Kentucky as the top priorities. You see 2 of them here. The top 2 are both in Madison County. The bottom 2 are governed by the Watershed Conservancy District in the counties. But the first one is actually owned by, I think, Berea. The cost there is going to be for the rehabilitation project between $14.3 to $20 million. So we understand that Berea has that match. So let's go on to the second and third. Red Lick, number 12, FRS stands for Flood Retarding Structure. That's in Madison County, and the total estimated cost to rehabilitate that dam is anywhere from $8 to $10 million. So the local sponsor's share is going to be somewhere between $2.8, $3.5 million. The other one that the NRCS has identified as a top priority, remember, we've got 200 of these throughout the state, but we're only going to talk about these three first. The third one is the East Fork Clarks River, FRS flood retarding structure number 32 in Marshall County. The total estimated construction cost to rehabilitate that dam is $10.5 million. So the local Watershed Conservancy District has to find $3.5 million. So we think that between especially the bottom two dams here, that $5 million that the legislature allocated for this will probably be taken up by those two projects. Before I go on and let Scott take the floor, are there any questions for me or Corey?
Representative King. Sorry.
Thank you. And thank you for bringing this to my attention. This is something I need to learn more about. I see the top three priorities. I looked very quickly through the two packets of handouts. Do we have a listing of the 200 or a map or a chart where we can see where these are all across the Commonwealth?
Scott, did you want to cover that?
Yeah, so we can provide that at any time, and it's actually in my presentation as well.
If no one else has any more questions, I'm going to. Pardon me?
Senator Tipton. Representative Tipton.
I was waiting until I was properly introduced. Along with Representative King's question about the list, do you all have these ranked by the condition they're in? Do you have any kind of ranking on that so maybe we would know in our area which ones might be moderate or poor or fair that might be coming down the pike that we might have to address in the future?
Yes, we were asked to put a list together a few months ago, and we've got a list about 10 or so that are ranked up there, and we combine the Division of Waters evaluation and inspection of it and the potential for rehabilitation because of high hazard potential classification.
And then Senator Boswell.
Can you give an example of the type of work that's going to have to be done requires that type of expenditure? I mean, just for example, I just completely rehabilitated a lake that I own myself for 40 acres, and pipes were rusted and things of that nature. But it seems like when we get the government involved, the cost goes through the roof.
Right. So if they want to use the federal matching funds, they have to meet the federal criteria, and that typically means a higher storm event that the dam has to deal with, usually the 100-year or higher. And that typically means raising the dam and changing the spillway, raising the spillway, armoring the spillway, or making a bigger pipe through the dam to meet those criteria.
So,
Chairman,
yes.
may I say Scott here probably is going to cover a lot of the questions that are being asked. It may be good to just go ahead and let him speak.
I agree. Thank you.
Appreciate it. As I said earlier, my name is Scott Schneider. I'm the State Conservation Engineer in Kentucky for the USDA-NRCS. And my presentation today is going to focus on the Watershed program, as we call it, and where it is nationally, where it started nationally, and where it is today, and where it is, and then I'll transition slowly into Kentucky and in the Watershed program in Kentucky. So the National Inventory of Dams, or the NID, there's 93,000 in nationwide and 29,500 dams NRCS assisted with. And of those 29,500, there's about 12,000 that would be considered under the Watershed program that we assisted with. The others that the NRCS assisted with would be like just regular farm ponds, but they are big enough to make the NID list. And they all come in all shapes and sizes. Some of these aren't from Kentucky, as you can tell by the red soil, but mostly in rural areas is where they're placed, and they're originally there to help, flood control and erosion control, and sometimes for recreation. And so a lot of people mention the current program law that it's under, which is the PL 566, which is the third one down, but there's actually a total of 4 different parts, different laws that this was funded through, or laws that were enacted so that we could use federal funding to build some of these dams and help some of the concerns out there on the landscape. Public Law 534, and then there was also the pilot program, which is kind of where it started. And then there's actually on the resources, conservation and development had a few dams. You can see there the number of dams that were in each type of law, and the majority are under the PL 566. That's the authorization for the Watershed program. And historically, the Watershed program has been the best example of federal, state, local, and private partnerships. The federal side would come in for the technical and financial assistance. Your local sponsors are going to be responsible for land rights, operation and maintenance, and states have also helped with funding and some technical support, and there's also been private easement donations. Here's a U.S. map of where the dams are located, and 47 of the 50 states have watershed dams on them. You can see that the southeast and the southern plains have a lot of these dams, and the different color dots are based on the public law that it was authorized under. And why did we get into the program in the first place? Well, it was for flood control, water supply, if you're a municipal place, erosion control, recreation, wetland restoration, wildlife, and these all nationwide equate to about 2.4 billion. That's the reason our predecessors went into these programs and built these dams across these rural communities or across this rural landscape. And we was mentioned earlier when a lot of these dams were built, but you can actually see there in this bar graph that in the 60s they were actually literally building 2 a day of these dams. And so in like the 64, it looks like it's 600. And then, of course, over the years, it's tapered off as far as building new dams. But you can tell where the majority was built. And that kind of equates to what we mentioned earlier, that there's a design life is coming due on most of these dams. And 50 years is typical. If it's a low hazard dam, if it's a high hazard dam, it may have had a 100-year life. And what that means really is that the sediment that it was going to collect and some of the other infrastructure parts were supposed to last 100 years. So it could store up to 100 years of sediment, or it could store, or the pipes and the infrastructure that it contains would have lasted and not corroded for 100 years. That's kind of the criteria we went off of. And you can see here since 2022, there's going to be 58%. So we're over halfway now of these dams are meeting their design life across the nation. And here's some examples of what's happening just in these dams that need attention. You've got corrosion on some of these pipes, deterioration of concrete. The upper right, you can see sediment. I got another photo of that one. In the background of this one, you can see sediment has accumulated in that stream that's coming in and filled that sediment, or filled that stream with sediment to the max, it looks like. And in the foreground, that's a pipe going through the dam. And this was the same, this is the structure in 1982, and then in 1995 there's the same structure, so it's completely filled in. Now, this is not necessarily a bad design of any kind, it's just that it's meant to collect it for 50 years, and then it needs to be rehabilitated. Here's a camera shot of inside of a pipe. It's a leaking joint. So these are just some things that we typically see that are going wrong with these dams, but in the most thing that we see is these encroachment of downstream development. People building homes, businesses downstream of these structures that the areas don't flood anymore because of these structures. They're doing their job, and people have gotten comfortable, have forgotten the flooding risk. Okay, so that was kind of a national picture. Let me transition into where Kentucky stands. We've actually used 3 of the 4 different authorizations in Kentucky to build watershed dams. And as mentioned earlier, 200 of them were built in Kentucky. And little stats of those, 48 are considered high hazard potential, 17 are significant hazard potential, and then 135 of those are low. And 131 are beyond the 50 years in old. And you can see the benefits that these give us annually: 5.5 of flooding and 6.7 of non-flooding, so a total about 12 million total of benefits. And there's the three that projects that we've mentioned that are currently funded, and they're all in the design stage: Red Lick 1, Red Lick 12, and East Forest Clark River 32. And we do have a completed project, Plum Creek 18, we did in 2007. I'll show a picture of that later. So here's a map of all the sites that are under the Watershed program in Kentucky. You can see it's heavily to the west. A lot of those dams are low hazard, but you can see that a lot of the dams, the majority of the dams, are out west. Now here's a breakdown of the high hazard. That's really more evenly distributed. The east and the west are about even as far as who has the high hazard dams. Here's significant if you're curious, mostly out west. And then here is the low hazard, which predictably is mostly out west. 135 of those. And as I mentioned earlier, downstream development is one of the biggest factors that we see for making these projects the need to have rehabilitation done. Of that 48 that were high hazard, 24 were originally designed to meet the high hazard potential classification. So that leaves us 24 that have been changed over their life to classified as high hazard, and that's mostly because of downstream development, because there's no authority to control the downstream development of a lot of these dams. And like I said, to date, we've actually rehabilitated one of those 24. So that leaves us another 47 to rehabilitate if you want to rehabilitate all of the 48. Which brings us to our rehabilitation program that is federally funded through the NRCS. And there's several phases of it. First is the request from a sponsor, whoever the owner of the dam is. Then we'll do a dam assessment. The dam assessment is the cheapest part. It covers the hazard classification, the general condition of the dam, and an estimate of how much it'll cost. That's a fairly cheap process. And then that'll be used to fund the next phase, the planning phase. And that could be $1 million a phase. And then the design, also probably $1 million phase. And the construction phase, as we mentioned earlier, could be in the up to $7 million to $10 million sometimes, depending on what we're doing to the dam. And just to further define what rehabilitation is, it's the work necessary to extend the service life of the dam and to meet the applicable safety and performance standards that are current. And here's a breakdown again of how you get eligible for it. It's got to be a high-risk dam. That gives you biggest priority. Some of these low-hazard dams could be rehabilitated, but they probably wouldn't rank high, and so therefore probably wouldn't get that federal funding, because across the nation there's many more high-hazard dams that are in need of funding. And NRCS will pay for the assessment, the planning, the design, and then 65% of the construction cost. And that 35% will be on the sponsor to cover. Main triggers, again, age of dam, structure problems, sediment, maybe there's some damage like there was spillway, but the big one in bold there is the downstream development, which changes the classification and therefore no longer meets the Division of Waters criteria or the national criteria for safety. If you're curious about the federal funding that's out there or has been spent recently, you can see since 1998, 2009, there wasn't a whole lot of funding nationally being put in, but since then, it's really taken an uptick, and I think we're pretty secure in having national funding there, at least for the predictable future. 2003, I just have a little bit shown there, but there is the actual, the 2023 numbers haven't fully come in yet, but here's the 2022 numbers. we've allocated $112 million plus, and those have gone into dam assessments, the plans, designs, and construction. So safe to say that the federal funding part is pretty secure, I guess is the point of this slide. So how to apply? Sponsors need you submit an application, and then we'll work with the sponsor to make sure that request is correct, and we'll submit that to our national office, and the national office will then rank it, and then they'll fund it. If you're wondering about some timelines, this is kind of the implementation timeline. The assessment is, it takes up to a year sometimes, usually less. The planning up to 18 months because we've got to do the environmental assessment. That's a big kicker. Then the design, 2 years. So we're talking, up to 5 to 7 years to get from the application to fully construction. Budgeting, I mentioned most of this before, but the sponsor needs to show evidence that they are committed and they can do their funding part, and they can do operation and maintenance of it. And the sponsor's responsible for the upfront reimbursement, and then the federal share will come in to reimburse them. And so just to kind of break the 65-35 down, so for every dollar the sponsor contributes, $1.86 will be contributed by the federal government towards these construction projects. And but we won't reimburse for any expenses that are for permitting, licensing, operation, and maintenance. And any part that's for a municipal part of the dam, that would be on the sponsor too. So if there was a city that wanted to use the water for the city, then that structures, piping, and things come from that will be on the sponsor to fund. But it would be under the design, but the funding for those additional parts would be through the city or for the sponsor. I mentioned earlier, this is one of our success stories that as far as NRCS has been involved in to rehabilitate, and it's the Plum Creek 18 in 2007. It was a fairly cheap one. We replaced the principal spillway riser, that concrete structure you see in the water, and then we did some work to the downstream tow drain, as we call it, and put some rock riprap on the downstream tow. So it ended up, the final cost was around $250,000. The sponsor was responsible for some of that, but NRCS covered about $150,000 on that. Any questions of kind of where we were nationally and where we are now with NRCS and the Watershed program?
We do have some questions. We'll start with Representative Hall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for the information and presentation. I think we heard from some of you all during the session about this issue as well, so it's certainly good to have the follow-up and get more details. I've got a couple of questions around the financing piece of this. So these top 3 priority projects, you said the first one, the local, I guess Berea City or Madison County, they decided to go ahead and be the sponsor and pay for their match and go ahead and do that. And so they didn't have to use the $5 million that we had already allocated in the budget. But is there any kind of requirement to assess the $5 million or the state funds for the local entity to kind of like co-sponsor together? That way the entire responsibility of that 35% match is not on the state of the Kentucky?
So the Soil and Water Conservation Commission, they're the ones that will decide who gets what. So we'll leave it up to them. That's their statutory responsibility. But it does look like those 2 dams, the one in Madison County, one in Marshall County, will eat up most of that $5 million that's already been allocated.
But there's no requirement for Madison County or Berea or whoever's the local owner, sponsor of the dam to put in some kind of local match.
Other than the 35%, no.
But we're providing the 35% in this case. What I'm saying
Correct.
is there a way where Kentucky can provide 25 of the 35%? That way our funding could be spread out amongst more projects. That way we can do more.
That would be good, but as we mentioned, the assessments that the Watershed Conservancy districts do is very minor. So it would have to be some other funding mechanism other than that.
And my only follow-up to that is Berea somehow was able to cover one of these themselves, so somebody.
Right, that's either a city government
So I think we ought to consider for the state to require some of these local entities to help us help them. I'm fine if we're going to provide the lion's share of this funding, but given the number of dams that we need to address and cover, it seems like we ought to be more fiscally conservative and conscious about how we use that funding and require some of these local entities across the Commonwealth to at least have some skin in the game when we're trying to help them. That's my comment there. And then there's 48 of these high hazard dams that would be eligible for the federal funding. Is that correct in the Commonwealth right now?
Yes, that's well, that's mostly correct. There'll be some high hazard dams that are out there now that don't need rehabilitation because they currently meet the state's criteria. They don't currently meet the federal criteria, but so it would be.
Okay. So I guess my question would be to how many total dams in the state of Kentucky right now would be eligible for the 65% federal match, and how much do we have a total number of dollars it would take for us to address those dams?
And so those 48, that 24 were originally low hazard or significant hazard. Those will get the highest priority for funding nationally.
Okay, it's 20. So there's basically 24 that weren't addressed. You know, they changed because of the
Correct.
So do we know how much it would take to the 35% match on our side to address those 24 dams?
Initial assessments of those.
Because $5 million, if it's
right, it's
ain't
not
gonna
nearly
cut it.
enough.
Yeah.
So we prioritized 12 of those 24, and the number we came up with to do the construction is about $97 million, and so we're looking at $34 million of the sponsor share for those 12, and so you can probably assume the same type of thing for the next 12.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Representative McPherson.
Yes, as much a statement as anything else. So we heard some testimony yesterday in the A&R that state of Kentucky had, I think, 7 counties in the state out of the whole United States that had more damage than anybody else had in natural disasters, most of these being floods. So if we're going to talk about return on investment, we probably need to look at these dams and what we're going to do with them in the future, because it looks like most of our disasters in the state of Kentucky are flood related. So I'm just saying return on investment and work on these as soon as we can.
Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Webb.
Thank you. I'm just glad dams are getting some attention. Gordon knows I've sponsored dam legislation for a long time, and this I'm glad the federal government's finally kind of stepping up and being a little more aggressive. But I'm curious as to the aggressiveness of the inspection protocol, whether the state and how much reliance or division of that responsibility is state and federal. And you mentioned the difference of criteria. And I'm a little interested in that. How much of a difference is it? And how's Kentucky doing for those standards?
Scott, if you'll address the difference in standards. Our within the Energy and Environment Cabinet, the Department for Environmental Protection has a division of water, and they are the ones responsible for inspecting the dams. So, just in the case of the Red List number 12 in Madison County, they have identified it as having many deficiencies. So that is why it's also come to the attention of the NRCS.
I think the main difference between them is the storm event that they're supposed to deal with, and I think our standards are just more up to date than Kentucky's. I can't be for sure of that because I'm not familiar exactly with what the Division of Waters is. But I'll give you one example. The criteria for doing the hazard potential classification, we go up from the top, if the dam was to breach and the water's at the top of the dam. Kentucky's is the auxiliary spillway, which is sometimes 5 to 10 feet below the top of the dam. So, and I think the Division of Water is flexible enough to use engineering judgment to go up to the top of the dam if need be. If you thought that, well, there is plenty of hazard downstream, we maybe should go that route. But I don't have a full understanding of the state's criteria versus the federal criteria. I think the Division of Water probably help me with that question.
I'd be interested in seeing that as a former environmental prosecutor, but I'd be interested in seeing that. And then what do we anticipate the federal dollar commitment being at present time and for the immediate future?
Nationwide, is that what you're talking about?
Mm-hmm.
All I can go off of is that my previous slide, and we're definitely within the $50 million to $100 million range most years that they're committing to it.
And the budget question would be, we're going into a budget cycle, and from a fairly immediate risk in light of the flooding that's already been highlighted and that we've lived with in East and West Kentucky, what would be a fair number, or will the department be asking for a specific amount to address some of this in your budget request? Or
I don't think we're prepared to say what a specific request would be because we do have to work with the NRCS with their budget when that's available, as well as right now we have 12 dams that are at the highest need. So this is not going to be something that we can do immediately, but which we think is going to cost, probably in the neighborhood of $24 to $30 million over time. So we haven't identified a specific amount that we would need.
And we anticipate that you will be trying to prioritize those and get those numbers to the respective committee of jurisdiction.
We can do that.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Boswell.
Just a couple practical questions. So the dams that we have existing right now, I have to assume based on your testimony, they were built not to the 100-year flood standards. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And so how many of the dams that we have built now have you found as an engineer to be inadequate? Because they're not built to 100. It seems like to me sometimes that my point I'm making is that sometimes I think the government comes in with overkill on these 100-year standards. And so I'm interested from a Kentucky perspective, from maybe somebody that has been involved this year. If you see things that are failing, then you can understand why they would be changed to a 100-year standard.
Right. So there's a distinction we probably need to make here. Just because there's a high hazard potential, that doesn't mean it's in poor health of the, if you will, of the dam. It just means that it doesn't meet the criteria for a large storm to hit it. For example, they could be perfectly well maintained, everything's in working order. It's just that it could overtop, and that overtopping it wasn't designed to do. For example, so all I can do is go off of what we've got so far, and it's the 24 that I always say would be in my opinion, the highest need.
I'm primarily concerned about the additional costs that might be involved in the construction from raising it from a 50-year flood requirement to a 100-year. And then the only other question I have is, you mentioned about environmental assessments. Are environmental assessments required? Are they necessary for an existing structure? I can understand now if you're building a brand new one. Why do we have to go through a new environmental assessment if we're just rehabbing an existing structure?
Well, that's a great question. We are usually raising the dam, as I mentioned, or lengthening the auxiliary spillway, which is the side channel that it would go across. So if they're like 50 feet, we may increase them to 100 feet wide to allow more water. We'll increase the top of the dam, and all those change the footprint of the dam or the impact area it has upstream for flooding. If we raise the top of the dam, it has potential to impact more upstream, and then if we make it wider, it has more potential to impact things laterally. And anything changes like that, we got to assess.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Armstrong.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the information. It's very interesting. I'm curious about the dams shifting from significant risk into high hazard risk. Did I understand you correctly that about half of those 12, it was largely because of downstream development? Is that right?
That's correct.
So I'm curious what we know about the dams that might currently be in that significant risk category that could very quickly shift to high hazard risk based on development, and what sorts of systemic communications we might have. What are the processes to communicate with local governments about that? Are these things taken into account when local governments are reviewing zoning and development plans? And do we have any sense of how many of our significant risk dams could very quickly become high hazard risk dams?
No, I don't have a good answer for you on how many of the significance could be high hazard, but if it's significant, it typically means there's a large potential for property damage, meaning maybe a road would get impacted, or there's a lot of significant outbuildings or something like that downstream that could be impacted. A bridge could be impacted fairly significantly, but the depth of water over it would not inundate, or be a detriment to passenger vehicles. So it's kind of in that judgment zone. You're like, well, it's overtopping stuff, but it's not really creating a hazard to life. You go to hazard to life, then you go to the high hazard standards. So it would take the building of a home, and then one home, it's high hazard. As far as zoning, I can't speak to that.
If I may have follow up, Mr. Chair?
Yes.
Are there any systems in place whereby the information that we have as a state or federal information is shared with local governments?
That would typically fall to the Watershed Conservancy District, communicating then to the Conservation District and then to the local government.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Senator West.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Like a lot of these things, there's a lot more glory in building the project than maintaining the project. And it sounds like the state of Kentucky has a lot of deferred maintenance staring us in the face. And if I can sift through what you're saying, we have a $100 million need, probably like an immediate need. And clearly the feds aren't going to cover their 65% on that if we have $100 million to cover the United States in federal funding. And the feds have only taken care of 19 projects. So if the state of Kentucky sees this as a need, an important need, and we want to put some more money into it, and we want to bypass the federal government and go ahead and fund some of these projects, can we do that, and what is the process of doing that?
So I want to clarify there that the government, or federal government, is supplying $100 million annually. And
but that's all 50 states, right?
Correct. Yeah.
Right.
So we'd have to get ranked and then money given to us at that time. But
if the state of Kentucky has $100 million in need, and the feds are supplying $100 million across the country, chances are we're not going to get $65 million from the feds to do.
Not in 1 year. That's probably
Right.
a good call. But
You could, because of the time frame that it takes.
You may remember
Done.
Scott mentioned the number of years to assess, make a plan, and finally get into construction.
correct.
So that does take time. We
I
recognize.
see what you're saying. So if we put more money in, there's a certain period of time where we can continue to go after those federal funds and pull those down. If we ever reach a point where we can't, where we've tapped out the federal funds, is there a way for us to bypass that system and just start working on these projects
I think
ourselves?
that would be up to you and the legislature.
Okay. But there's nothing legally at the federal level to prevent us from?
No, they would need to meet the state criteria because there wouldn't be federal monies involved, and that's all they'd have to do if they want to rehabilitate it from a low hazard to a high hazard. So the Division of Water would weigh in there is what they have to do to get up to that level.
Thank you.
Mhm.
So Representative Stalker.
Follow up to the previous question. So if we were as a state to say, thanks, but no thanks, we're going to go ahead, we've got the funds to do this. Am I correct to assume, though, what I thought I heard you say is it would have to be at the state level as far as the build? Would that make us ineligible for future federal funding on anything that we build if we don't meet the federal criteria? Does that make sense, if I'm understanding that correctly?
Let me see. Can you restate your question again? Sorry.
Yeah, so when we have things that are built, what I thought I heard is that there's a state level and a federal level as far as maybe the way things are built and the way that they're constructed. And I'm just curious about if we were to move forward, would we need to make sure that we are building things at a federal level in order to make sure that down the road, 50 years, 100 years, if something needs rebuilding or attention, that we wouldn't make ourselves ineligible for funding? Does that make sense? Like almost like a car warranty where they're like, if you touch something, like you're no longer eligible, like you've kind of null and voided ability for us to help you. Does that make sense? Or maybe there's not two different standards and I'm misunderstood to begin with.
No, you're correct. There could be the potential. I'm going to give you an example. The sponsor is fully control. What they can do whatever they want, as far as the federal level is concerned. But your question's valid. So let's say that to meet the state criteria, all they would need to do is lengthen the width of the spillway, and then that would pass through the acceptable storm, and it wouldn't need to be raised. But in the federal sense, it would need to be raised. If that would not make it ineligible for rehabilitation down the road, it would not. No.
That answers my question. Thank you.
Thank you. As you can see, this is why I wanted you to come and educate all of us. I've had the opportunity to meet with these individuals a couple of times, and we've had some of these conversations, but I saw the need for the committee as a whole. Some of you are on this committee, also are on A&R, and I wanted you to get the picture of what the financial needs are going forward. Doesn't all have to be in the 2024 budget, but we need to get a line in the budget that says there's a long-term need out there, and there'll be a need for ongoing funding as we go down the road. Let's switch gears and bring the next group up because do what? I'm sorry. Y'all all came together, so instead of having two different groups, we got one group, so that's very efficient. We appreciate that. Hang on just a minute then before you leave.
Mr. Chairman, let me just say that we do have flooding inundation maps on our cabinet website, or we can send you that link if you would like to have that.
Yes, any information you can provide would be great. And I will say, I will continue to meet with this group. We have, as you can see, it's complicated and complex. There's a lot of moving parts. Representative McPherson has sat in on some meetings with me, Representative Pfister. If some of the rest of you have a keen interest in this, you have some watershed dams in your district and you want to be involved in the conversations, we'll include you on the invite list to sit down and help us figure this thing out. As I briefly mentioned, I'm looking for a way, and this is where I'm asking for your help and your input, to streamline this process, to meet the needs in a timely manner. I think it'd be very unfortunate if some of these high hazard dams broke and flooded downstream and caused property damage. And as you mentioned, development has happened downstream, homes and businesses, loss of life is there. So I want to keep this front and center, but at the same time, I want to look for a way to bring it up to date. This was started for the most part, 50 years ago. The individuals that were around when this started are not there now. I think the understanding of why the dams were built has passed with time. The individuals that started this are no longer around. So it's a new era. I'm looking for a way to streamline it and modernize it and bring the reconstruction of these dams to a faster pace, for lack of a better term. So that's what our meetings have been about. That's what we're working on now to try to hopefully bring legislation before the General Assembly in 2024. We would appreciate help and input. One of the visions I had was, and I'll use the example of our road fund. Every 2 years, we put X amount of dollars in the road fund. And I want to get this conservation district and our watershed dams, a line item in the budget, and be able to put some money towards that every 2 years as you identify what the needs are and what the dollar amount is. As you said, you have all the background work to do, the engineering and the EPA issues. So it can take 2, 3, 4 years just to rehabilitate one dam. But we have to know that the money is there to do that. And that's my vision going forward is to get this a line item in the budget so that you guys know the money is there and we can start moving forward on getting these dams rehabilitated. With that being said, has anybody else got a question or comment before we wrap this up? I do want to say we have a group here today with us that we didn't take the time to introduce, and I won't try to introduce everybody in the room, but our Kentucky Cattlemen's Association, the executive committee, is visiting with us today. Why don't you guys stand and be recognized, because not everybody knows who our executive committee is for Kentucky Cattlemen's. And welcome. Any other groups to be recognized, or if not, then we'll item number 3 on your agenda, no action required, but if you have an interest in that, we have that information available. Our next meeting will be Thursday, July the 9th, 9 a.m. I'm sorry, July 20th at 9 a.m. Here in this room. Thursday, July 20th. If there's nothing else, this meeting is adjourned.